Ladies and gentlemen, if you could kindly take your seats, I think we shall get things underway. Thank you very much indeed for coming here to the headquarters, particularly on such a beautiful evening as we had this evening. We will have a preview of the GITR, of the results from the authors, which is the World Economic Forum and INSEAD. And I'd like to take this opportunity also to thank Cisco for their help and support. But first, let me hand you over to a man who needs no introduction, Professor Klaus Schwab, founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, to say a few words. Professor Schwab.
Thank you very much, Mark. Cordially welcome to this launching of the Global Information Technology Report. It's for us always a special moment if we give birth to such a document, because we know we have quite a substantial responsibility since this report is used by many businesses and governments for benchmarking purposes. We are proud, it is our 7th report now, and we are covering 127 countries, so we must cover about 95% of global GDP. This year, some of you may remember, our annual meeting in Davos had the theme the power of collaborative innovation. So our report 2007-2008 looks very much at the ICT as an enabler of innovation. I want to mention that this report itself is a product of collaboration. We have not only our friends, and I would like to welcome Professor Soumitra Dutta from INSEAD. It's not only a cooperation between INSEAD and the World Economic Forum, but we are working together with 142 different partner institutes around the world. So welcome again, and I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Fiona Paua, who is, I think who is our senior director in charge of our strategic insight team and of our publication team, and I'm sure you will also present the other colleagues who have contributed to this report.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Schwab. It is my pleasure to join in welcoming you to this very special event. We have been doing this, it is quite a tradition now for us that we do this preview. And we are delighted that you're able to participate with us, because this enables us to give you the context by which we produce this report, which is quite important. But it also enables us to engage you in a dialogue, for us to listen to your questions, answer to your questions, listen to your feedback for this report. It is important for the forum to present the findings, not only of this report, but our other reports as well that we produce, in the constructive light for which it is intended. Now, the Network Readiness Index, which is what is featured in the Global Information Technology Report, intends to capture the preparedness of economies, particularly of individuals, businesses, and governments, to capture and leverage the benefits of information and communications technologies towards competitiveness and economic development. And what we would like to do is to present this as a unique benchmarking tool. The report is really not the end in itself. We would like it to be part of a process, a yearly process of benchmarking and evaluation. So with that as a context, we would like to encourage you to go beyond the headlines of the rankings and to use the opportunity today and going forward to really look into the details of the report, because that is where the real value lies, we believe, of this study. With that short introduction, let me hand now the floor to the co-editor. Thank you, Fiona. good afternoon. Thank you very much for coming. We are very excited. This is the 7th edition of the Global Information Technology Report. It's another very exciting edition. We are featuring once again the computation of the Net Readiness Index, which is our main methodological tool to assess how much country leverage technology for increased development and competitiveness, as well as a series of external contributions from industry experts, academics, international organizations such as the OECD and the European Commission. Before handing the floor to Soumitra to comment on the results of this year, we just give you some background information on the report. As I said, the report is actually one of the main products of the Global Competitiveness Network at the Forum. This is the 7th year we are publishing it. So it has been so far an annual report, very well received by the public, very well received by the policymaker and the business community. It has really become over the year a very authoritative instrument for dialogue and debate between the business community and the government on building roadmaps on how to improve competitiveness through network readiness and ICT. This is just to show you what Professor Schwab was saying earlier on about the coverage of the report. This year we are covering 127 economies, 5 more than last year, actually from around the world, where we are covering more than 95% of the global GDP. So it's a pretty big geographical coverage. The project was actually launched in 2001. As Professor Schwab mentioned, it was at the beginning a project we were doing in collaboration with Harvard, with the with the Information Technology Group of the Center of International Development in Harvard. It's actually something that the World Economic Forum felt it was time to do, because as you know, we have been assessing country competitiveness for almost 30 years now, and we really, a few years ago in 2001, we started thinking that it was really important to deep dive on information and communication technology, giving the importance of ICT for competitiveness and for improving, everyday life for citizens, in terms of also poverty reduction, and in general the impact ICT has on productivity increases. The main methodological tool we are using for this report is a Network Readiness Index. It's a very comprehensive framework assessing the degree to which countries leverage ICT for increased development and competitiveness. And what it does, it's really to set an international framework, mapping out which are the enablers for this kind of network readiness. This is just to show you the correlation, the very high correlation between the Network Readiness Index, network readiness, and GDP per capita. There is also a very high correlation with our other index, the Global Competitiveness Index, showing really the importance of ICT for competitiveness in general for countries. This is the framework of the index we're using to assessing network readiness. It's a framework which is actually based on 3 main principles. The first one is the fact that environment is key, meaning that a country cannot really leverage ICT if there isn't an ICT-friendly and conducive environment. When we talk about environment, we mean 3 types of environment. The environment for doing business in a country, looking at general kind of environmental dimension and variables. The regulatory environment, in general for doing business, but also for ICT. We have a very interesting variable looking, for instance, at the degree of development of the ICT legislation in a country. And the infrastructure, which is a part of the environment. Infrastructure, we mean both hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure, meaning human resources. We all know the importance of human resources for network readiness and competitiveness in general. The second idea in this index is the fact that it's really a joint effort from the main stakeholders in a country, in a society. So it's not just the government responsibility to leverage ICT, even if it's true that if we look at the case of the most network economies, there is always a leadership from the government, really a vision on the part of the government of the importance of ICT. But really it's not just the government, it's really a joint effort. It's really a joint multi-stakeholder effort in leveraging technology. The third principle is the fact that readiness is kind of key for usage. When we say readiness, we mean the preparation, the degree of preparation in using ICT. So in a way, you can use a computer to
to kids in a school, but if they are not, trained to use the computer, if the teacher are not trained to use the computer, then it's not going to be very, very useful in a way. So it's really readiness and preparation is the precondition for usage. And I have another nice figure showing the correlation between the two components, the readiness component and the usage component. As you see, is again a very high correlation. The framework I have described is actually translating itself in a 3-pillar index. As you see, one sub-index is looking at the environment, in the 3 dimension I mentioned earlier on, and the other 2 are looking at the readiness and usage of the 3 main stakeholders, so individual, business, and government. In terms of ponderation, it's actually a simple average of the 3 main sub-indexes. Just a few words on the data we are using. This index, as well as the other indexes that the World Economic Forum produces, is a mixture of hard data coming from international organization, kind of quantitative data, as well as survey data, perception data. This perception data is actually our value added in a way, because it's our data set, really the original data set from the World Economic Forum. It comes from an executive opinion survey that the forum is actually conducting every year in more than 130 countries. And it's a survey we do with the top business leader in each country. So the idea is really to gather insight on different dimensions of their business environment. So in a way, there is an element of subjectivity in our indexes, but we actually think that it's an asset more than a weakness, because it's really giving an idea, giving an insight on what is the perception of the business community in each country. And since these indexes are really meant to offer a tool for a neutral debate between the business sector and the government, we really think that it's important for the government also to know what is the opinion of the business sector in different dimensions of the business environment. So just to give you an idea of some of the variables we are using, as you see, it's an index composed by 68 variables. We have 30 variables in the environment, 23 in the readiness, and 15 in the usage. As you see, the mixture again of hard data, like for instance, US utility patents, the high-tech exports are obviously hard data, kind of things that you can quantify. And while, for instance, the quality of the scientific research institution is survey data, because it's really something really looking at the quality. So it's something that really the executive opinion survey is giving us, is being very useful for us really to capture this kind of more qualitative dimension in matter. Readiness, as you see, for instance, we have a lot of very important and very interesting variable on the extent of the government vision for ICT. For instance, or the government success in ICT promotion. We have a variable looking also at the e-government development in countries like government online services. So there is really a lot of interesting variables which can be used. We kind of put together, structure together in an index, but you can actually gain insight on different dimensions which are relevant for reassessing network readiness of a country. So with that, I think I'll hand the floor to Soumitra for the really interesting part of the results.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you very much, Irene. If I can just add one comment to the model. You might have seen a number of different indexes or indices about technology that have come up in the last few years. And I think there are 2 characteristics which distinguish this piece of work. The first one is the degree of longitudinal data that we have collected. So we have around 7 years of data today available, and that is unique. And on the basis of that, we can actually compute different sort of relationships, we can get different insights, and Irene presented some of them, and I'll present some other insights to you later on. And the second thing which is unique about this is the model is multidimensional. It's not just focused on technology. It's focused on a holistic ability of an economy to benefit from technology. And what we have found from our research is that the environment of a country is extremely important for helping that economy to benefit from technology. Technology alone does not lead to the kind of development benefits or competitive behaviors that you might actually sort of expect if you just focused only on one dimension. Now, if you look at the rankings, and of course the rankings make for good news sort of stories and headline items, but really in some sense for us these rankings are some kind of overall benchmark that we use in looking at trends and looking at more deeper relationships. Now here you see some interesting factors. So on the left hand side you see the top 20 ranked economies for this year. Then you also have over here the ranks from last year. And these are some scores on a scale of maximum of 7. Now, what are some of the big picture messages out here? If you look at the top 10 ranked countries, usually for the last several years you find Scandinavian countries very prominently focused in the top 10. You find the US very prominently focused in the top 10. You find Singapore very prominently focused in the top 10. And this year we have a new entrant in the top 10, which is Korea. So you see, in a sense, a pattern emerging out there in terms of the US, Scandinavia, and some countries in Asia achieving really very high levels of excellence globally. If you look at the next sort of 20 or 30 countries, you start also seeing some interesting messages or interesting points. So we look at the position of Israel. Israel is a very small country. At the same time, it comes up extremely high in the rankings. And once again, we are very well aware of the technological strengths of this country, in both in creating new technology-based enterprises and also in terms of the sort of technical sort of power of the people and the knowledge in that country. If you look at, for example, Estonia, Estonia comes in at position number 20, and Estonia is a country that is often quoted as the best practice of technology usage. And what we often do not realize is the reason why Estonia does so well is mainly and to a large degree because of the quality of leadership and strategic vision that the country set for technology for itself. Estonia came out of a very strong history of a closed society in the ex-Soviet bloc, and when they became independent, one of the strategic decisions made by the country's leadership was we don't want to regress back into that kind of secretive closed society ever. So for them, the internet and access to the internet was a key pillar of ensuring a free society, sharing of information, and much more empowered citizens. So you have a number of other interesting, let's say, factors. You can look at them. You look at, for example, India. India is this year ranked number 50. Last year was ranked number 44. Again, India is doing well in some areas of technology, but clearly it has a number of challenges on the global environment. A lot of parameters actually quite poor for India. And you see some other variables in some other countries affecting their positions. Now, one important point to highlight, especially when you look at the rankings of countries over time, is that these ranks are not absolute by definition. They are relative ranks. So when a country slides, it does not mean that the country has not made progress or in fact is going backwards. Often it means that other countries have made probably more progress along some key variables in the same time period. So what we find in general is that it's very important to keep in mind that these relative ranks. Now if you look at some of the key, let's say, performers who are ranked number 1 along the key dimensions of the framework, as Irene mentioned, there are multiple dimensions that we consider. On the first 3 are the 3 sub-pillars of the environment pillar: the market environment, regulatory environment, and infrastructure. The next 3, these are the 3 pillars of the readiness sort of component: individual readiness, business readiness, and government readiness. And the last 3 are on the actual usage by the 3 actors. And you can identify and see who are doing better or worse along some characteristics. So you see, for example, Singapore carries, or at least has earned the number 1 position along 3 of these sub-pillars, which gives us a strong position on the whole. You look at, for example, Denmark, which is doing extremely well in government usage, and that gives it the number 1 position in that category. Denmark, which is ranked number 1 this year, is doing pretty well, in fact, along all the different dimensions. And that's one overall high performance which has helped it to move up #1 position this year. And then you have other countries, of course, which are not a big surprise per se, but at the same time they give you a sense of how they have evolved over the last several years. Now, maybe it's worthwhile spending a little bit of time on the other piece of analysis that I was going to share with you. Now, as I told you, we have been doing the study for the last 7 years, and the number of countries has increased from 75 in the first edition to today about 120. And so it's very difficult to do a precise comparison of the actual rank over time. But what we have done is we have divided up the countries based on deciles in various categories, and then try to understand how have these countries' positions varied over time based on relative deciles. Now, you look at these countries that have made the, let's say, the most significant upward movements, you see some interesting patterns. So you see, for example, 3 of the BRIC countries, China, India, and Russia, having made fairly significant upward moves. So they have, in fact, in relative terms, moved up by 3 or 4 deciles in the overall relative ranking. You have some other countries like Vietnam and Ukraine also having made tremendous upward movements. Egypt and Guatemala and Jamaica and Jordan have also done significant, interesting upward movements. Now, of course, what you can do is you can go and look at specific countries and try to understand better what are some of the actions that these countries have taken that have enabled them to move upwards significantly. You can do the same for India, you can look at China, look at Russia, you can look at many of these other countries. And those examples of shifts across countries over time they provide a very good source for inspiration for other economies that want to also make the kind of an upward movement. Now, also interesting is looking at the movement across regions. And this kind of analysis, once you aggregate countries in a certain region, also presents interesting sort of insights. And for us, what was interesting was to actually observe that the Middle East as a region shows the most significant increase on the whole in use of technology and its ability to use technology over the last 7 years. And clearly the Middle East has started focusing on technology as a key enabler of creating knowledge-based economies. As we all know, many countries in the Middle East, they're trying to move away from a dependence on oil and trying to create more innovation-centric, more knowledge-based economies. And technology is a very key enabler of that. In fact, in many parts of the Middle East, the internet penetration rate has gone up the highest of the last 6 years. And this is, I think, very good news for all of us. Now, Irene mentioned that the report, the book that we have published, of course, has 2 major components. So one component are the rankings and more detailed analysis of the various scores on the various pillars and so on. There's another very important component which consists of more in-depth studies and analysis on specific topics. So typically what we do is we invite experts from different organizations to contribute to this book. So this year we have a number of important contributions from different organizations, different experts. We also do a number of case studies. And the case studies help us to go more in depth and understand better the movements or the changes in some economies around the world. So this year we have focused on 2 examples of good use of technology over the last several years. Singapore, which has progressively moved up to a very high position in the technology world, and the state of Qatar. Qatar also is using technology strategically to create a more modern, progressive society. We also have studied from the European Commission looking at small and medium-sized businesses and how technology is being used for that. So that's pretty much, in a sense, the core presentation that we want to share with you. I'm sure you probably have some questions, and Irene and I will be happy to answer them or at least engage in a dialogue with you.
Great, thanks very much. I'm not sure actually we're set up perfectly to do questions and answers. Maybe perhaps if the 2 of you come up here and use this microphone, it might be best. Can I just, I've been asked to remind you that this report is under embargo until Wednesday at noon. So, particularly for the journalists here, please could you pay attention to that embargo? We'd be most grateful. If we have some microphones, what I would suggest we do is take some individual questions we can discuss in more detail afterwards at the reception. Could you say who you are and where you're from? It gives us an idea of what we might say, I guess. And wait for a microphone to come as well, because that will help you. So, gentleman there, yeah.
Jamil Chaves, São Paulo, Brazil. I have a couple of questions. Can you explain why Latin America is basically falling in your rankings for the last 3 years, and especially in Brazil? What is the reason that is basically putting them behind? Secondly, do you have any measure of economies or governments that adopt open source as governments who are more ready or more or enabling more the use of technology? If you have this comparison between, I don't know, perhaps Microsoft and others, other suppliers. And thirdly, I promise it's the last one. How much does freedom to use the content of internet counts? I saw that the one, for example, the country report you have on China shows that freedom of the press, they're ranking 119. But how much does that count in your overall weighing of these criteria?
Okay. Starting with Latin America.
Yes, working.
Works.
Actually, it's true that Brazil is in a downward trend in the last 3 years, but Latin America last year was actually going up quite a lot. This year, the case of Brazil, take the case of Brazil, is not really, Brazil is going down in the ranking, but it's not going down in terms of its own score. Brazil is actually improving from last year in terms of its own performance vis-a-vis the past. The problem is that there are other countries which are kind of moving faster than Brazil and Latin America. And this is actually something that should make us think, because it's true that ICT is such a dynamic sector that in competitiveness in general, that's really, even if you improve 1 year, as was the case last year for Latin America, you cannot really be safe that you're going to improve for the rest of the time. So it's really a call to really focus all the time on ICT in the national agenda, and really not kind of rest on saying, okay, we improved 5 positions for last year, so now we are happy for the rest of our days. In the case of Latin America and Brazil, it's I think case of Brazil has progressed a lot in terms of, I don't have to tell you, but for instance, government, Brazil is one of the leaders in the region and also in the world. It's more, if I have to say some very generic comments for all the Latin American countries, it's more a problem of structural weaknesses. Like, I don't know if you have, maybe I haven't really discussed about that, but we have the environment component. It's really looking at, the regulatory environment, for instance, for doing business, or the environment for doing business, like, the number of days to open a business, or the number of days, the World Bank indicators. And Brazil, in particular, and Latin America, to a lesser extent, it's really, really needs to improve on that variable. Markets are really overregulated in Brazil and in Latin America in general. There is a problem also on education. The quality of education, especially higher education, which is the one we are looking for this index, is still quite poor. Again, Brazil is a big country, and our index is kind of looking globally. So it's, in a way, it's kind of hiding some of the cluster of excellence, which you have in Brazil. The sophistication of the business sector in Brazil, which is very high. You have a lot of multi-Latinas coming from Brazil and Mexico and Latin American countries. So I would say that in general, for Brazil, really the problem is more a problem of structural reforms, which of course have also an impact on ICT. But in general, in the case of Brazil, it's really the same weaknesses that you find when you look at general competitiveness issues. So market which are regulated, education system which is not up to first-class standards, and red tape in general. Really. Second question was
open source.
Open source. We don't have any. No, we don't.
We haven't actually gone and studied the impact of open source on a country's competitiveness of ability to use technology. And I did a study separately. separate study looking at open source in schools. And one of the key challenges we faced was it's often very difficult to identify because schools use a degree of open software, open source software. So it's very difficult to find pure play open source schools or organization. So trying to actually measure the impact of open source is something that we find really difficult to do at the macro level. I think we'll go and look at a much more micro level in terms of the impact on that, but we haven't included that in this study. On the third thing that you asked around freedom of the press, I think, of course what we do is we use variables as proxies of certain factors that we think are important. And what we do believe is the quality of governance, the quality of openness in a society is measured different things, and one of them is the freedom of press. So from our research, we are finding that the environmental factor is extremely important, whether it's structural or whether there are more governance and more soft freedom of press included related.
Another question, yeah. John.
Yes, good afternoon. John Zarakostas. I'm a freelance writer for newspapers in Britain, United States and Singapore. I was wondering if in your study you've managed to factor out subsidies to the various sectors in the ICT area. Some of the countries in your top 10 are famous for big government guidance, and some still have their main architecture 64% state-owned, or in the case of Switzerland. Thank you.
Well, we don't necessarily factor out government subsidies in the study, and we don't necessarily consider that as good or bad. So I think what you find is typically in countries where there's a strong government push for supporting technology and technology strategic weapon, the government does play an important role in either facilitating it or directly subsidizing it. And in many countries, government procurement is a very key tool also used to support technology and new technology ventures. So I think government subsidy is something that we don't necessarily consider as bad per se. So I think many countries will make a decision about whether to invest more in technology, and they might choose to do so simply because they believe it's critical for the overall competitiveness of the country.
Another question. Okay, in that case, you have a chance. If you John,
Yes.
one very quick one.
Yes. Yes. I was wondering if you also looked at the performance of ICT by different sectors of an economy, and I was wondering how the financial sector, which is the biggest user of the ICTs, is faring at the moment in Wall Street and in Zurich. Thanks.
No, we don't make a sector-wide study and analysis in this study. It's much more a country-level analysis. So financial sector, I don't know comments on that. I guess it's a separate discussion.
Yes.
Finnish Daily. Could you give us please some details? What is the reason for the Korea to come up so strongly? And then a detailed question about the environment. Could you tell about the details about the importance of the taxation, but which taxation do you mean actually there?
Okay, on the Korea story, if you have been to Korea, you probably you go there and you see the impact of technology, how important it is for the country's overall national strategy development. The government is, for example, very strongly pushing this vision of new Korea, ubiquitous home, ubiquitous computing. Basically, they're trying to very heavily spread this notion that Korea leads in this one important area. Now, if you look at other factors, clearly they have a very strong educational focus, very strong educational system, a very strong culture, also in terms of using new technology. If you look at, for example, some of the best new innovations in mobile space, mobile telephony coming from Korea, even in the social networking space, places like Cyworld. Cyworld has about 1/3 of the Korean population online. And so I think there's an issue of culture, education, and the government orchestration of some of the key players, and also the emergence of global champions from Korea. Today, you have a few global champions in the space, which I think does not necessarily happen easily. If you look at, for example, Brazil, I mentioned earlier, Brazil has got very good companies, or some other sectors are not necessarily global champions in the ICT space coming out of Brazil. So I think it requires dedicated focus in trying to create these kind of global champions. The tax issue that you're mentioning is linked to the doing business study done with the World Bank. So I don't remember the exact definition of which is the element of the tax that they are measured, because the doing business and study and doing business in country X study, the World Bank, they actually have a very specific process or a very specific instance that actually measure across all the different countries. So I have to go back and look at the detail of that.
Yeah. And also we have a question from the survey, which is measuring how distortive is the tax system. But it's kind of generic in general, because it's really the idea, it's, you know, that in general, if the taxation system is distortive in general for doing business, so also for the ICT. In many cases for the general environment, we use general variables also, you know, as a proxy of more specific ones.
Great. Yes, gentleman at the back.
Philippe Montage, World Radio Switzerland. I do wonder how you get to number 3 in the case of Switzerland, where you have a highly non-competitive, monopolistic market, extremely high cost of connectivity, and no policy on the government level. I've never heard any Swiss cabinet members talking about ICT, except in the Davos. Explain that to me.
Well, what you said is something that also comes out from our rankings. Actually, in Switzerland, the natural industry is led by the private sector, the business sector, and the individual. If you look at the scores for the government readiness and usage, they're kind of much lower, about 18-20, which is, you know. But in general, you know, at least the data we're using shows that it's not that expensive in Switzerland. Actually, it's quite. I mean, the ICT penetration rate is quite high, and especially also, you know, Switzerland can really base this natural readiness on a top-notch education system and extremely efficient markets. Also in terms of, you know, financial system, as we know, it's very much developed, and this is very good in terms of, for instance, we are looking at variable like the sophistication of the financial system and the venture capital availability, for instance, which is key for, you know, especially startups and to foster innovation. So, but yes, you're right on that. The government is not really leading the process.
But just one important thing to keep in mind is that the index does not only talk about technology companies per se. It talks about how the economy as a whole uses technology. So that's important to keep in mind.
Okay. Time for one more question if we have one. Otherwise, I suggest you grill our co-panelists over the canapes. Thank you very much.